I don't know why I came here alone. Maybe it was the need for quiet. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't as afraid of being alone as I thought I was. Either way, I regretted it the moment I stepped into the cabin. It wasn't the cabin itself that made me uneasy at first. It was small but sturdy, tucked deep into the woods, far from anything or anyone. The walls were thick logs, sealed well against the cold. There was a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with a couch that had definitely seen better days. It had electricity, but no internet, no cell service, and only a weak radio signal. That was the point, though. I had wanted isolation. I had been here once before, years ago, with a couple of friends. Back then, it had been a fun weekend, filled with drinking and loud laughter. This time, I was here alone.
No distractions.
Just me and the quiet. I arrived in the late afternoon, just before the sun dipped behind the trees. I had packed enough food for a few days, a flashlight, some firewood, and a couple of books. I figured I'd spend my time reading, hiking, maybe even writing. Something about being disconnected always made me feel more productive. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the small wood stove, cooked some canned soup, and read until my eyes got heavy. I slept on the couch instead of the bed. I don't know why. Maybe I just didn't feel comfortable sleeping in the back room alone. The couch was closer to the door. Sometime during the night, I woke up. No reason, no sound, just awake. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, filling the cabin with a faint orange glow. I listened, waiting for something to tell me why I had woken up, but there was nothing, just silence. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The second day I spent exploring the area. I found an old trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. It was overgrown but still walkable. I followed it for a while, letting my mind wander. The quiet was nice. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. About a mile in, I came across something strange. There was an old, rusted-out truck, half buried in the undergrowth. It had clearly been there for decades. The windows were shattered, the tires long gone. Nature had started reclaiming it, vines twisting through the broken windshield and moss covering the hood. I peered inside. Empty. Just a few scraps of fabric and something that might have once been a seat cushion. I wondered how it got there. The trail wasn't big enough for a vehicle, at least not anymore. I didn't linger. There was something about it that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I turned back toward the cabin. That night, I locked the door. I hadn't the night before. There hadn't been a reason to, but something about that truck had left me uneasy. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but still, I slid the deadbolt into place. I fell asleep faster that night, but again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, I knew why. There was a sound outside. First, I thought it was just the wind. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I held my breath, listening. The fire had burned low again, casting just enough light to see the outlines of the furniture. The footsteps moved around the side of the cabin, then stopped near the door. My heart pounded so loud I thought whoever was outside might hear it. I stayed perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Finally, the footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Large, deep impressions. Someone had definitely been there. I told myself it was probably a hunter, maybe a hiker who had gotten lost. But why hadn't they knocked? Why had they just stood outside? I wanted to leave, but part of me felt like I was overreacting. Maybe it had just been my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed it. The third night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the couch with a flashlight and a knife from the kitchen, waiting. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer, heavier. Whoever it was didn't just walk around the cabin, they tried the door. The handle rattled. The deadbolt held. Then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed. An hour. 2. Just as I started to believe they were gone, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A whisper, right outside the window. I couldn't make out words. Just a low, almost wheezing murmur. I stayed frozen, gripping the knife so tight my hand ached. Then, slowly, the whispering faded. I don't know how long I sat there before the sun finally started creeping through the trees. But the moment it did, I grabbed my bag, shoved what I could into it, and left. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, miles away. I drove without stopping until I was back home. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? There was nothing supernatural about it.
No ghosts, no monsters.
Just footsteps, a voice, but that was enough. I still think about that night, about whoever or whatever was outside that cabin. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't ever want to find out. I had planned to spend the weekend alone in the woods. The cabin belonged to a friend's uncle, a small, weathered structure deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. It was the perfect escape from the constant noise of my daily life. No work, no responsibilities, just silence and nature. I packed light, just the essentials. Food, water, a flashlight, a hunting knife, and my old revolver, a habit from my father, who always said it was better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. The drive was long. The last stretch nothing more than a dirt path cutting through dense trees. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, staining the sky with orange and pink. The cabin was exactly as my friend had described, small, simple, but sturdy. It had one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living space with a wood stove. A single window faced the thick woods behind it, another in front overlooking the clearing where I had parked. The place smelled of old wood and dust, but it felt safe. I spent the first evening settling in. I stacked firewood by the stove, checked the water pump, and made sure the locks on the doors and windows worked. There was no electricity, just a few old oil lamps hanging on the walls. I lit one and placed it on the small table. Outside, the forest was quiet. The only sound the occasional rustling of leaves. Felt peaceful. That peace didn't last. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. It was faint, barely noticeable, but enough to pull me from sleep. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon scavenging near the cabin. But then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps, not the random movement of an animal. Someone was out there. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I reached for my revolver on the nightstand and crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. The oil lamp had burned out, leaving the cabin in darkness, but the moon was bright enough to cast shadows. I scanned the clearing, but I didn't see anything. Just trees and my car, untouched. Maybe I imagined it. Then something moved near the tree line, a shadow just at the edge of the woods. I couldn't make out details, but it was there, standing still, watching. My grip tightened on the revolver. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow shifted, turned, and disappeared into the trees. I stayed by the window for another hour, waiting, listening, but the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, and went back to bed, gun on the nightstand. The next morning, I checked outside. There were tracks in the dirt near the tree line. Human tracks, too large for an animal, too distinct. Someone had been there, watching. I thought about leaving, but I had driven hours to get here, and a part of me refused to be scared away by some stranger wandering the woods. Maybe a hunter, maybe just some drifter, Either way, I decided to stay. I wasn't defenseless. The day passed without incident. I fished at the nearby stream, chopped firewood, tried to push the unease from my mind. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the anxiety crept back in. I made sure the doors were locked, the windows secure. I kept the revolver within arm's reach as I sat by the stove, listening to the crackle of burning wood. Then I heard it again. A thud, this time against the cabin itself, like something or someone had pressed against the outer wall. I held my breath, listening. Then, footsteps, slow and steady, circling the cabin. I stood, heart hammering, gripping the revolver so tight my fingers ached. The footsteps stopped at the front door. I waited, then a soft knock. Not a friendly one, not someone in need of help. Just a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I didn't answer, didn't move. I wanted whoever was out there to think the cabin was empty. My pulse roared in my ears. Then another sound, this one worse than the knock. The doorknob rattled. I raised the revolver, stepping closer to the door. I didn't say anything. Whoever was outside was testing if it was locked, finding out if they could get in. I took another step, making sure my weight was even, my stance solid. Then the rattling stopped. Silence stretched for what felt like hours. I stood there, waiting. Finally, footsteps moving away this time. Slow, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. Morning came and I checked outside again. More tracks. This time, they led from the Treeline straight to my door. I locked up, packed my things. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It had come back. It had tested my door. That was enough for me. I wasn't going to wait and see what happened next. I threw my gear into the car and climbed in. Just as I started the engine, something caught my eye, movement, back near the trees. I turned my head, and there, standing just at the edge of the woods, was a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. He didn't move, didn't step forward. He just stood there, watching. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into reverse, backed up onto the dirt path, and took off, tires kicking up dust and gravel. I kept my eyes on the road, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the trees thinned and the town came into view. I never went back to that cabin. A week later, I told my friend about it. He said his uncle never mentioned anything strange happening there. He even went up to check it out himself and found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone ever being there. But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there that night, and I know they were waiting for something, or someone. It started with my uncle. He owned a cabin deep in the woods, a few hours away from town. It wasn't some cozy, well-kept retreat. This was a real, isolated, old wooden thing, built years before I was even born. No running water, no electricity, just a fireplace, a few lanterns, and whatever food you brought with you. My uncle used it for hunting trips, but he always said he liked the peace of it. He said the silence out there was different, deeper than anything you'd ever experience anywhere else. That should have been my first warning. He had asked me if I wanted to watch the place for a few days while he was out of state. It seemed simple. Just keep an eye on things, make sure no animals got in, and if I wanted to, I could do a little hunting myself. I wasn't much of a hunter, but the idea of spending time away from everything, from the noise of life, seemed kind of nice. I told him I'd do it. The first day was uneventful. I drove up in the late afternoon, and by the time I got there, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The air felt different out there, cooler, sharper, untouched. The trees towered over everything, their branches forming a tangled mess of shadows that stretched across the ground. The cabin sat just at the edge of a clearing, its wooden frame darkened by years of weather. It wasn't much to look at, but it stood strong, solid. Inside, it was just as I remembered from the last time I had visited as a kid. A small cot in the corner, an old wood-burning stove, a thick rug covering part of the creaky wooden floor. My uncle had left some supplies: canned food, bottled water, extra firewood stacked by the door. The air inside smelled like aged wood and dust. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. That first night, I built a fire in the stove, ate a can of beans, and listened to the silence. And my uncle was right. The silence out there wasn't like normal silence. It felt heavier, like something was pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just quiet. It was an absence of sound, something deeper, something wrong. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I jolt awake at the smallest noise. The wind brushing against the cabin, the creak of the wood settling, the distant snap of a branch outside. Every sound made my skin crawl, but I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. I wasn't used to being this alone. The second day, I went out to check the perimeter just to get a feel for my surroundings. The trees were thick and the trails barely looked like trails at all. Just thin breaks in the undergrowth, places where animals had pushed through over the years. I found some tracks, deer mostly, but something else too. Something larger. A bear, maybe. I had my rifle with me, but I wasn't exactly an expert. I just kept it slung over my shoulder, more for comfort than anything else. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in the normal, there's wildlife nearby kind of way. This was different. Felt like I was being watched. That night, I barricaded the door. It wasn't that I had seen anything. I just felt like I needed to. Something in the back of my mind kept whispering that I should. I wedged a chair under the handle and kept the rifle close to me. The fire burned low in the stove, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. I told myself it was fine. It was just the isolation getting to me. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A sound outside. Not an animal. Not the wind. It was a deliberate, steady movement. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Heavy. Moving around the cabin. I held my breath, my body frozen. The footsteps stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. My heart pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there might hear it. Then, a scraping sound against the wood, right outside the window. A slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled along the outer wall. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, gripping the rifle, staring at the door, the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I didn't sleep that night. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I forced myself to step outside. There were tracks in the dirt. Human tracks, large, barefoot. They circled the cabin, stopping by the windows, the door. Whoever had been out there had been watching me. I packed my things. I didn't care about staying another night. I didn't care about proving anything. I just wanted to leave. I grabbed my bag, my rifle, and stepped off the porch. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. At the edge of the clearing, right where the trees began, there was something carved into one of the trunks. Deep, deliberate cuts, forming words. Come back. I left. I didn't run, but I walked fast. Faster than I've ever walked in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. The whole drive back, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me. I didn't, but that didn't make me feel any better. I told my uncle what happened. He didn't say much, just listened. Then, after a long silence, he nodded and said, "Yeah, that happens sometimes." I never went back. I never wanted to spend the weekend alone in that cabin. It wasn't mine to begin with. It belonged to my uncle, who had let me use it for a few days to clear my head. The place was buried deep in the woods, nearly a 20-minute drive from the nearest paved road. No phone service, no internet, just a landline that only worked when it felt like it. I told myself I'd be fine. I needed the time away from everything, away from the constant noise of the city. I packed enough supplies to last me the weekend. Canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a hunting knife my uncle insisted I take. Just in case, he had said, tossing it onto the passenger seat of my car. I thought he was just being paranoid. The drive up was peaceful, the roads empty except for the occasional deer darting into the woods. The cabin itself was nothing special. One story, a small porch out front, wooden walls weathered by time and rain. It had been in my family for years, mostly used for hunting trips and the occasional escape from civilization. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The furniture was sparse. A small couch, a coffee table, a creaky wooden chair near the fireplace. The kitchen had a fridge that ran on a generator and a sink with well water. There was one bedroom with a twin-sized bed and a dresser, nothing fancy. The bathroom was small, but at least it had a working toilet and shower. The windows were thick with grime, but they let in just enough light to keep the place from feeling completely isolated. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest, crickets, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I had never realized how much I depended on the background noise of the city until I was faced with absolute silence. Around midnight, I heard something strange, a single, sharp crack, like a branch snapping somewhere in the distance. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Deer, maybe. The woods were full of them. Still, something about the sound put me on edge. I locked the door before heading to bed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure what had woken me at first. Then I heard it again, something moving outside. It was faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not an animal. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. Then, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. The creak of the porch boards under someone's weight. I reached for the hunting knife on the nightstand, gripping it tight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. Whoever it was, they weren't moving, just standing there. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the sound of retreating footsteps. The porch creaked again, lighter this time. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting for the footsteps to return. They didn't. Morning came, and with it, a sense of unease. I stepped outside, looking for any sign of what had happened the night before. There were footprints in the dirt, leading from the trees to the porch. Bare footprints. Human. I told myself it had to be some drunk hiker who got lost. Maybe they thought the cabin was abandoned. That was the only explanation that made sense. Still, I felt uneasy. I spent most of the day inside, keeping the knife close. That night, I locked the door again, shoved a chair under the handle just in case. I left the flashlight beside me, my ears tuned to every sound outside. It was sometime after midnight when I heard it again. The same slow footsteps, moving through the trees. But this time, they didn't stop at the porch. They moved around the cabin, circling it. I held my breath, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. The footsteps stopped outside my window. The only thing separating me from whoever or whatever was out there was a thin pane of dirty glass. I could feel them standing there, just on the other side. Then, something even worse. A sound I will never forget. The slow, deliberate sound of a fingernail dragging across the window pane. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound came again. Long, slow, deliberate. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to break in. They were trying to scare me, and it was working. Then silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in place. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, the first rays of morning light were creeping through the trees. I forced myself to go outside. More footprints. More proof that someone had been there. I followed the trail into the woods, moving slowly, cautiously. The footprints led to a tree about 50 yards from the cabin. A tree with something carved into the bark. A single word. Stay. I don't remember running back to the cabin, but I must have. I grabbed my things, threw them into the car, and left without looking back. I didn't care about the food I left behind, or the fact that my uncle would probably call me a coward. I just wanted to get away. I never told my uncle what happened. Never told anyone. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there. And whoever was in those woods didn't want me to leave. They wanted me to stay. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset, my truck crunching over the gravel driveway as I pulled up. The place was isolated, deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. That was the point. I wanted to get away from everything: work, people, noise. I had a week off, and this was supposed to be my reset. The cabin was old but sturdy, a single-story structure with a small porch and a pitched roof. The wooden panels were weathered, showing signs of age, but it had charm. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine. A stream ran somewhere nearby. I could hear the water flowing faintly through the trees. Inside, the cabin was simple. A main living area with a couch, a small kitchen in the corner, a bathroom, and a single bedroom. The furniture was old but functional. The bed had a thick quilt draped over it, and a wood-burning stove sat in the corner, the only source of heat. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and barely any cell service. I was truly alone out here. After unloading my bags, I checked my supplies. I had packed enough food and water for a week, plus extra just in case. The cabin had a small pantry stocked with some canned goods, though most of it was old and dusty. I found some firewood stacked near the stove, but I figured I'd gather more tomorrow. By the time I stepped back outside, the sun was dipping below the trees. The forest looked different in the fading light. Deeper, darker, more alive. I stood on the porch for a while, just listening. There were no cars, no distant hum of civilization. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Probably just deer. That night, I built a small fire in the stove and made a simple dinner. The warmth was comforting, the glow of the flames dancing against the wooden walls. I read for a while by lantern light, then decided to turn in early. The bed was firmer than I liked, but I was tired from the drive. Sleep came quickly. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Something had stirred me from my sleep, but I wasn't sure what. The fire had burned low, casting only faint shadows. I listened, holding my breath. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the trees creak and groan. But there was something else, too. A sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps, not an animal, not the random sounds of the forest. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the cabin. I stayed still, my heart hammering. My mind tried to reason it away. Maybe a deer, maybe the wind playing tricks. But no, these were human steps. Someone was out there. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make noise. I clicked it on and pointed it at the window. The glass reflected my own nervous face, but beyond that, only darkness. The footsteps had stopped. For what felt like hours, I lay there listening. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted back into a restless sleep, waking up to the pale light of morning. I stepped outside, scanning the ground. The forest floor was damp, holding impressions well. Near the edge of the clearing, I found them. Footprints, large ones. They circled the cabin once, then led back into the woods. I wasn't alone out here. I spent the day keeping busy trying to shake the unease. I chopped some wood, went down to the stream to refill my water bottles, tried to convince myself it was just some hiker passing through. But something about those footprints gnawed at me. There had been no signs of approach, no path leading to the cabin. Just a single trail coming from the woods, circling, then vanishing back into the trees. That night, I locked the door, secured the windows, and kept my flashlight within arm's reach. I told myself I'd be fine. Whoever it was, they were probably long gone. Around midnight, I woke again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The footsteps were back. Slower this time. Closer. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight. The sound stopped just outside the front door. Then, a soft, deliberate tap against the wood. Knocking. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocking came again. 3 soft taps. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I stayed awake until dawn. My body tense, every sound amplified. Eventually, sunlight streamed through the window, and I finally exhaled. I stepped outside, my hands shaking. The footprints were there again. This time, they led from the forest to my door. And then something new. A deep gouge in the wood, right near the handle. Someone had tried to force their way in. I made a decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things in record time, throwing everything into my truck. I didn't even bother eating. As I started the engine, I stole one last glance at the cabin. The footprints, the scratches on the door. A feeling settled in my gut, something between fear and relief. As I pulled away, my tires kicking up gravel, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. A figure standing at the treeline, too far to see clearly, just standing there watching me leave. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I never went back to that cabin. I drove up the winding mountain road, the sun dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows over the gravel. The rental cabin was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. I needed the isolation, a break from everything: work, people, noise, just me and the silence. The cabin wasn't much. A single-story wooden structure with a sagging porch and a roof that looked like it had seen better days. The listing said it was old but full of rustic charm. In reality, it looked forgotten, a place time had let slip through its fingers. I stepped inside, the air stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and dust. The living room had a stone fireplace, a sagging couch, and a single rocking chair. The kitchen was small, stocked with the basics: a half-rusted stove, a dented refrigerator that rattled when it ran. The bedroom had a lumpy mattress covered in a thin sheet, and the bathroom was nothing more than a narrow space with a shower that barely had water pressure. I dropped my bag on the floor. It would do. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the sound of the woods, the wind moving through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. Felt peaceful. By the time I went inside and shut the door, I felt a strange sense of relief.
No emails.
No people, just silence. But something felt off. Not wrong, just strange. I told myself it was just my mind adjusting to the solitude. I wasn't used to being this alone. I double-checked the locks, turned off the lights, and lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling until sleep finally took me. Sometime during the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was pitch black, so dark I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath felt too loud in the silence. Then I heard it, a sound outside, not an animal, Not the wind, something moving. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't footsteps exactly, more like shifting, like someone standing just beyond the window, adjusting their weight from one foot to the other. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer. I reached for my phone, the glow from the screen illuminating the room. Nothing outside the window.
No shadows. No chaps.
Just the endless dark of the trees. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. My mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a deer had wandered too close. Maybe I had imagined it. The forest was full of noises. I just wasn't used to them. I spent the day hiking, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, the trees towering high, their branches knitting together overhead. I followed a narrow trail until I reached a small, stagnant lake. The water was still, too still, like glass. As I stood there, staring at my reflection, I felt it again. That same feeling from the night before, like I wasn't alone. I turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just silence. I started back toward the cabin, walking faster than before, my pulse thudding in my ears. By the time I reached the porch, my hands were slick with sweat. That night, I locked the doors, pulled the curtains shut, and sat with my back to the wall. I kept the fire going, the glow of the flames pushing back the dark. I stayed up as late as I could, watching the windows, listening. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again, closer this time, a sound just outside the door, a slow, deliberate movement. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my hands clenched around the iron handle. My breath was shallow, my skin prickling with cold sweat. I waited, listening, heart hammering in my chest. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion won. I closed my eyes for what felt like a second, and then I woke up. Morning light filtered through the curtains, the fire nothing more than dying embers. I forced myself to move, to stand, to check the locks. The door was still shut, the windows untouched, but something was wrong. The rocking chair on the porch was turned. Not facing out toward the trees like before, facing the cabin. I packed my bags within minutes. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking. The keys nearly slipped from my grip as I shoved them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I backed out, gravel crunching under my tires. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if someone was standing in the trees, watching me leave. I drove straight to town, found a motel, locked the door, and didn't leave until morning. When I returned the keys to the rental agency, the woman behind the desk barely looked up. "Didn't stay long," she muttered. I didn't answer. I just walked out, got in my car, and kept driving. I never went back. I don't know what was in those woods. I don't want to know. And I sure as hell won't be renting another cabin anytime soon. I drove up to the cabin just as the sun dipped below the tree line, spilling a burnt orange glow through the dense forest. The place belonged to my uncle, an old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. I needed time away from the city, the constant noise, the pressures of work. A week alone in the wilderness sounded perfect. No people, no emails, no stress. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. The cabin itself was small, built from thick logs with a pitched roof and a stone chimney. The porch creaked as I stepped onto it, and the front door, heavy and old, groaned on its hinges. Inside, it smelled of aged wood and dust. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and something faintly metallic, perhaps from the old hunting gear still hanging on the walls. There was no electricity out here. A small wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and an oil lantern hung from a hook near the door. The only furniture consisted of a simple cot, a wooden chair, and a table scarred with knife marks. A single window overlooked the thick trees that surrounded the clearing. I locked the door behind me not out of fear, but habit. No one was supposed to be out here except for the occasional hunter or hiker passing through. Still, it felt isolated, secluded in a way that made the air feel heavier. I shook off the feeling, unloaded my gear, and set about making the place livable for the next week. The first night was uneventful. The wind whispered through the trees, and the occasional creak of the wood settling kept me company. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the long drive. Morning came cold. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, and my breath was visible in the cabin's dim light. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside to gather firewood. The air smelled clean, untouched. Everything was still, except for the occasional rustling in the underbrush, probably a squirrel or a rabbit. As I gathered logs from the pile, I noticed something odd. The dirt around the cabin was disturbed, as if someone, or something, had been walking around. Large, uneven footprints trailed along the side of the cabin. They weren't boots, and they weren't shaped like any animal tracks I recognized. They were erratic, dragging in some places, pressing deep into the soil in others. I told myself it was probably a bear, maybe a sick one moving strangely, but my gut told me something was off. The rest of the day passed quietly. I hiked for a few hours, following a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. The forest was silent, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears. I had been in the wilderness before, but this felt different, like something was listening, watching. By the time I returned, the sun was setting. I built up the fire, cooked a simple meal, and tried to shake off the unease growing in my chest. That night, something woke me, a sound, faint at first, then growing louder. A rhythmic scratching like nails against wood. It was coming from outside. I lay still, heart pounding. The scratching moved, slow and deliberate, from one side of the cabin to the other. Then came the sound of something heavy pressing against the door, just for a moment before retreating. I reached for the hunting rifle I had brought with me, gripping it tight. I didn't move, barely breathed. The scratching continued for what felt like hours before finally stopping. Morning came, and with it a deep sense of unease. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, and scanned the tree line. The footprints were back, deeper now, circling the cabin. I followed them a few yards into the woods before they simply stopped. No signs of where they led, just gone. I thought about leaving then and there, but pride kept me from packing up. I convinced myself it was an animal, a big cat maybe. I'd seen mountain lions act strangely before. That had to be it. That night, I barricaded the door with the chair and stoked the fire high. The scratching came again, but this time it was different, faster, desperate, clawing, and then something heavier, a thud against the cabin wall, hard enough to shake the wood. I didn't sleep. I sat with the rifle in my lap, waiting for the first sign of daylight. When dawn came, I made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed quickly, stuffing my gear into my bag, and stepped outside. Something was waiting for me. The ground was torn up, the earth dug into deep grooves. The footprints were everywhere now, leading from the woods to the cabin, circling it again and again. And in the middle of the clearing, something sat. A dead deer, its body twisted, throat torn open, entrails spread across the dirt. I didn't think. I ran to the truck, started it up, and sped down the narrow dirt road without looking back. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I will never go back to that cabin. And neither should anyone else.